here to the home of the Undisputed champion and Ferrari's biggest fan. As today, of course, after enjoying lots of the summer and still really enjoying it, then we will go back from the summer break all refreshed for what will now be not the final 10 but 11 rounds of the championship. And in this exclusive race introduction, we will take a look at the circuit that is saying goodbye to the Formula One for good and probably really for good, which is the Dutch Grand Prix, which will host around 14 but really only maybe really around round 12 of the 2026 FIA Formula One World Championship. It will also host the fifth. That is right, the fifth, the penultimate round, obviously, of that sprint championship. It is the penultimate sprint Grand Prix weekend of the season to kind of send off the circuit in Zandvoort, which only stayed on the calendar for a mere 6 years. Well, better than some of the tracks, during the past decade that only stayed on the calendar for maybe 4 years, but still. Zandvoort, basically located very close to the Belgium, has decided to pull out of the Formula One altogether, and obviously will be replaced by the Portimao in Portugal starting from next year. But here, with a lot of the sprint weekends, obviously, happening in the first part of the season, really in what is really the first half, we could have the first champion, the sprint champion, even though Formula One doesn't really count it. So in this race introduction, we will talk about that sprint championship more in great details because obviously over the summer we had lots of brilliant ideas as we were playing in the top class waters of beautiful places, and I'm sure you've been to some beautiful places like the Hawaii, maybe the Maldives or the Bahamas, you name it. So we will talk about that. Also some news about our Formula One drivers, even though at the time of the recording more can come, and also another track that is a big favorite, I would say, with the fans and the drivers and teams alike, that is making temporary but maybe even a permanent return to the Formula One calendar, even though I kind of have mixed feelings about the way it is hosted, but we will definitely discuss that. And then we will take a look at the format. Actually, we can start with the format and to tell you how exactly we will do the first race after the summer break before we go to the Temple of the Speed at Scuderia Ferrari. We definitely want to get a very memorable, legendary 1-2 for all of the fans. 44 years from Mario Andretti, who in 1982 planted that Scarlet Ferrari on the pole position for the Monza Grand Prix, car number 44. Lewis Hamilton, could he be another driver well into his 40s to achieve the same feat? We are definitely sure of that. But here, Zandvoort, very critical, obviously, circuit that really made the return to the calendar only maybe because of Max Verstappen, who obviously, with his 4 championships, has built the kind of maybe a controversial legacy of his own. But we are kind of happy to see it go, even though we run really well. So we will also talk about our achievements over here, and then take a look at the all-important drivers and constructors championship. So for the format, because obviously we are playing that concurrent 2025 season, so you will actually see my Hungarian Grand Prix, at the same time, and then during the Italian Grand Prix, you will see how well I mastered the Dutch Grand Prix. So that will be very, very interesting. And then when the new track, obviously the Madrid, that is debuting in the middle of September, takes place, we will then be chasing that elusive 5th victory at the Temple of the Speed. But here in Zandvoort, obviously, I only won 1 time, and I will be chasing my 2nd victory. So we will talk about that. Obviously, this race introduction, you will see 24 hours before the solitary free practice 1 of the Dutch Grand Prix will take place on Friday, where you will, of course, then see my hard lap. But in the F125 cars, with the F126 cars, you will see that hard lap where I will describe the track in great detail. And actually, surprisingly, it will be the most successful, in terms of the overall level that I so far managed, to do in the Scarlet Ferrari, because I obviously started from the Barcelona Grand Prix, right? So we've pretty much, only done 6 over here, the F126 laps, and here we have gotten to the highest level. So we will definitely tell you, how to race that circuit, and that will be happening as the drivers will be doing the sprint qualifying. After that, when they will will be doing the sprint, you will actually see the red hot lap when I will put, it will be a very special red hot lap, the first of this season, and you will see exactly why when you see it. And who knows what will happen, also during that hot lap, because obviously, Zandvoort is known for such elevation changes, so there might be also some earthquakes coming up as the fastest cars of the Formula 1 will go through the sand dunes there of the Zandvoort. And then obviously, once the sprint finishes, and you will have the qualifying, you will then see my qualifying for the Hungarian Grand Prix, where I've always been on pole position. I will be aiming for my 6th pole, and then 24 hours after the sprint, you will see my exclusive sprint reaction. And then when the Dutch Grand Prix takes place, we will do the Hungarian Grand Prix, where we will be chasing our 4th victory, and obviously 65th overall. And then 24 hours after the Dutch Grand Prix, hopefully we will be celebrating with the Italian national anthem, but not for the championship leader Andrea Kimi Antonelli, but for Scuderia Ferrari. That's right. So this is the plan. Speaking obviously of the drivers, so Lewis Hamilton seems to be very content with his lifestyle, and obviously being the main title challenger to Antonelli. It will be very important that he takes that new love, as we are now basically gonna be celebrating the love, or the start of our celebrations with regards to my family. Where we obviously, that will happen actually shortly after the Italian Grand Prix, so we cannot wait to see how that special kind of a wedding occasion will take place. But you can see with Hamilton, having pretty much all the support and being on top of the car, and generally, especially ever since, if you maybe disregard the first couple of races, he's generally really been, faster than Leclerc. This is a great time to again reset, erase all of the mistakes. You are one of the most, if not the most experienced driver on the grid, especially in terms of racing at the front. So, it's funny that it is Antonelli who's actually very, very stable, not making mistakes, and it is the 7-time champion, obviously sometimes with the teams making the mistakes. So hopefully Lewis can erase that out. But again, can he win 8th championship for Scuderia Ferrari? That should have been Michael Schumacher 20 years ago in 2006, right? I know what you guys are thinking. For Charles Leclerc, we would like to, wish him a big congratulations, and we are really, really, excited to see, the baby Leclerc. Obviously, he's a great couple with his, what is now wife, looks great, and definitely deserves, some love in his life. That is the announcement that Charles Leclerc will be a dad. So you can see over here, will that mean that he will never get to his ultimate pace again? Because remember, they always say that, with each baby, you lose a couple of tenths, because obviously, you will be a little bit more careful. Hopefully not. Again, Leclerc, arguably, if not the fastest driver over a single lap, at least definitely now in the modern Formula 1, even in history. He has an outside, chance for a championship, but it's kind of like with the current champion, Lando Norris, the reigning champion, right? Of course, yeah, if all of a sudden they would go on a run like Antonelli did, yes, it could be actually relatively easy to maybe reel in Antonelli, because, nowadays, you can see that when you bring in an upgrade, you can easily gain quite a lot of time, 5-6 tenths, and all of a sudden, being 15-20 seconds behind, you can be 15-20 seconds ahead. So nothing is impossible, right? And if we are winning and McLarens and Red Bulls are in between us and Mercedes, that could just be, 3 or 4 races, or maybe 1/4 of the season, as you can see on that beautiful scarlet red Ferrari calendar. But, to be honest, Antonelli has always had a pace pretty much at every single race. So, for Leclerc, that will be quite interesting to see what happens, as, it is so hot, as you can see here in the summer. And yeah, for the new circuit, there is another big news. So the Malaysian Grand Prix will be held as the Bahrain Grand Prix at the Sepang International Circuit. And we love Sepang. Obviously, we won a dead race on my happy names day. We obviously cannot even race it now. But I believe, as Scuderia Ferrari, especially in, one of the first editions, we've always run very well at Sepang. So, this is a great addition. Because it now means there will be a triple header. Basically, we'll go to Baku, then you will have Malaysia and Singapore. It kind of makes sense from the logistical standpoint, but it doesn't make sense in terms of, just suddenly putting in a Grand Prix there, right in the middle of the season. But I guess the reason is that, we might not run in Qatar or in Abu Dhabi. Hopefully, I believe that the final will be in Abu Dhabi, but I wouldn't be surprised if the season just finishes in Las Vegas as a 21 round race, or maybe 22, we will see. It is difficult again, to see exactly what will happen. But this track again, it would be great to have Malaysian Grand Prix on the calendar. We were sad when it obviously left the calendar in 2017. We did race it 3 times, with mixed results, but we won it before. So we love the track. It's a great racing track. A real pure tropical place. But ever since Singapore basically came in, it's like Zandvoort and the Belgium Grand Prix, right? Kind of maybe too condensed in terms of the schedule. Because the circuits are pretty much just couple of hours of car drive away, so we can understand, but to be it's a very strange arrangement, right? And we hardly ever had like Bahrain Grand Prix basically kind of like paying for a lot of the the race fees over here. The Malaysian Grand Prix, it's a little bit strange, but I guess Formula One really realized that we could only have 20 races, and obviously you want to keep the championship going also. Because as things stand at the moment, with Qatar not being the sprint Grand Prix weekend of the season, if Antonelli would arrive at this exact championship position to Las Vegas, after the checkered flag would fall at Las Vegas, to be exactly precise, he would have been the world champion, which would kind of sort out the issue, right? What if, with regards to the races being held there. So that is definitely the big news, and we will see how it goes. And of course, lots of the upgrades, also the ADUO, which is for the additional development of the power units. These tokens, because we do not have such a strong ICE, the internal combustion engine, as Mercedes and Red Bull. So we expect to make another step forward. Obviously our battery is working really well, and it will be interesting to see what happens at Zandvoort, because when we went to Austria and especially Hungary, the results were ultimately disappointing, even though in Hungary it was mostly strategy and just a bad luck and a surprisingly bad start. But the fact that we did very well on power circuits such as the British Grand Prix and the Spa, means that maybe we are really strong in terms of the power department, especially the energy deployment, and not so much in the aero, which everybody thinks. Plus that rotating wing is really now helping us as Scuderia Ferrari. So a lot can change. I expect it actually to change, and it would be great if we start dominating here from Zandvoort. So let's take a look at our history here at Zandvoort, shall we? As I turn around this beautiful scarlet red retina iMac. So over here, let's take a look. So we will go to Netherlands for the last time, and for the first time we will be sprinting here. So this is how the circuit Zandvoort over here looks like. Again, resembling a little bit, that Hungarian Grand Prix, right? But here you have the Tarzan corner, great overtaking move. This is where Verstappen crashed into me in 2023 edition, and I lost a brilliant chance to go from 20th to 1st, like I did, for example, in 2017 British Grand Prix. So I was really upset at him. Some of the turns over here are really challenging, especially here you go well over the crest, the turns 2 and 3. It is important to throw the car there with authority, accelerate quickly, as you will see, even with F126 cars. And going up the hill, turns 4, 5 and 6, between turns 5 and 6, it will be interesting how the drivers handle it. Will they use the boost over there? Because obviously you will have the straight mode on the start finish straight, but here there's no straight mode over there, definitely no straight mode, because you open up front and rear downforce, so the car will be very light, and you do have to turn quite sharply through turns 5 and 6. You actually will see some of the issues with regards to the car not accelerating anymore. But then you really have to be brave going into the turn 7, to throw the car nicely in for the early turn in, and then over here use pretty much a lot of the battery, especially through, for example, this super fast turn 8, which is really, you have to tackle it almost with a full speed. Usually when you will have more downforce, as you will see, it will be, easier to just, go right through it. But yeah, it is very easy to have a nasty accident here on the outside. So we will see how the cars can handle it. And again, no straight mode over here through this section, because the Zandvoort is a really old school track. It's hard to overtake because it's narrow, but also because you are constantly turning. So there is pretty much only one racing line, one specific way you go about it. But into turn 9, this could be overtaking opportunity. You have to actually, brake, because it is downhill. So, you are not advised to apply 100% brake pressure, but, gradually, decrease the speed. And then over here, with lots of battery get through turns 9 and 10 early on the power with the straight mode over here, not really overtaking opportunity into 11 because it tightens up so much. You can see that here it's actually quite wide. It's probably the widest part of the track. But here, because it is so narrow, it's quite amazing that Charles Leclerc last year, before he became a dad and before he became a husband, he pulled off probably the overtake of the season on George Russell, going through, that section. That was quite amazing. Over here, as you will see during my hot laps, you gotta be a little bit careful coming out of turn 12 because there is a little grip and quite a lot of sand and gravel, especially if some drivers will, just dip the wheel into the gravel and, it will get onto the track. And then here, turns 13 and 14, nowadays it's just, very quick, deceleration. You throw the car and immediately on the power. By this time, the straight mode will start right in front of the pit lane, so you cannot go through the bank turns because obviously some of the cars would be spinning. And when you go to the pits, be careful, like Lewis Hamilton find out, you will be approaching it at well over 250 kilometers per hour, so you gotta get the braking right. You don't want to get a 5-second penalty, 5-second time penalty for speeding in a pit lane. 72 laps, so could be a long race, especially if it's gonna be raining. But obviously for the sprint, that should be 24 laps. That's gonna be actually very, very interesting how the drivers will handle it, because the time degradation is quite severe, quite high here at Zandvoort due to the nature of the turns. So would anybody actually make a pit stop to make that sprint distance to complete the sprint faster with one pit stop? That never happened before. I don't believe that will be the case, but maybe even running the hard tires could be the option. So yeah, this is how it is, and this is how Zandvoort looks like. So you can see, it is that typical kind of the gloomy Dutch, British, Belgian countryside where we, spend our high school years. But obviously, a very, very important region for the world, for the innovation, but also in terms of, for example, the wealth. And here are the Ferrari stats. So since 1952, it's a very old track. Ferrari, we've won here 8 times, right? But for example, we won twice with Alberto Ascari, who is now the only driver Antonelli can beat to become the most successful Italian Formula 1 driver ever. That's quite amazing. And of course, Niki Lauda, the same, for example, for the 7 pole positions, 2 by Ascari, 2 by Lauda and other, drivers, Ferrari drivers, 10 pole positions, and surpassing also 2 by Ascari, 2 by Lauda. It can be also more by Luxa, of course, and then 18 podiums. We gotta be on the podium. We didn't get on the podium during, the Hungarian Grand Prix. That was disappointing, so we definitely have to go for it. But this track, traditionally, when we came back in the 21st century, we were not so strong. So this is pretty much about the Zandvoort circuit, how it looks like, with obviously their flag. And now let's take a look at the 2026 Formula 1 Drivers' Championship. So who exactly we will be competing against? Andrea Kimi Antonelli leading with 219 points. Definitely the man to beat. Again, he could have been beaten in Hungary. He was subdued. But man, I think if he ran that one-stop strategy, if he stopped under the virtual safety car, Norris was very lucky that he didn't get stuck behind Piastri, because Antonelli still could have won it. So we definitely need to not outpace just Russell, who really seems broken at the moment, but especially Antonelli, who is a real challenge. So Lewis Hamilton, 50 points behind, 169 points. Let's take it race by race, and obviously starting with a sprint. Show the Mercedes who the bosses are, and then win the race, hopefully with Leclerc second. George Russell is third on 160 points. It will be interesting to see what happens. He's actually leading the sprint championship. We will talk about that standings very, very shortly. But in the races, it's quite funny, right? That you will think, okay, the most experienced driver would not be the making mistakes. The least experienced driver would be, that the sprints will fit the younger driver, not the older driver, right? Because F2, F3, these are pretty much sprint races. But it's actually all the way around. That's quite amazing this season. It's pretty much done on its head. And also, for example, in the FIFA World Cup, you could have seen the same thing happening when, for example, Messi and Yamal went next to each other. So I'm really surprised that the experienced drivers are not simply stamping out the authority, but actually cracking under pressure. So Charles Leclerc is fourth for us, Ferrari, 138 points. Lando Norris, reigning world champion for McLaren, 128 points. He won one sprint, he won one race. Hopefully he won win more. 6 Max Verstappen, Red Bull, Bull 109 points, 7 Oscar Piastri McLaren 92 points, 8 Isaac Hatcher Red Bull 68 points, going strongly, but again, bit of the pace. 9th Liam Lawson Racing Bulls 43 points, 10 is Pierre Gasly Alpine 42 points, 11 Arvid Lindblad Racing Bulls 23 points, 12 Franco Colapinto Alpine 19 points, 13 Oliver Berman Haas 18 points, 14 Gabriel Bortoleto Audi 10 points, 15 is Carlos Sainz Williams 6 points, 16 is then Alexander Albon Williams 5 points, 17 Esteban Ocon Haas 3 points, 18 Nico Hülkenberg Audi 2 points. He was loving the fact that he finally scored some points. 19 Fernando Alonso. What can Aston Martin do? Only 1 point. Can he get more? Maybe Lance Stroll, 20th. Lance Stroll, Aston Martin, he actually outraced Alonso in Hungary. We couldn't believe that actually happened. 0 points. 21st then Valtteri Bottas Cadillac 0 points, 22nd Sergio Perez Cadillac 0 points. So this is how the standing looks like, and of course where you finish and how well you do can have a serious repercussions if you will even be on a grid in the 2026 Formula 1 season, because the silly season where obviously some drivers move will start very shortly. At least they haven't started at the time of the recording, might happen by the time the Zandvoort, the final Dutch Grand Prix starts. For the 2026 Formula 1 Constructors Championship, so Mercedes leading with 379 points, but also, having torrid time of late. If we keep it perfect, we are on 307 points, second Scuderia Ferrari. This could be a little bit like 2024, where we are getting stronger and stronger towards the end of the season. By this time, we will claim that 17 Constructors Championship for Scuderia Ferrari. McLaren 220 points, quite far behind. Fourth Red Bull 177 points, fifth Racing Bull 66 points, 6 Alpine 61 points, 7 Haas 21 points, 8 is Audi 12 points. Audi looking solid bet to actually finish 7, I would say. 9th is then Williams 11 points, 10 Aston Martin 1 point, 0 Cadillac 0 points, 11 Cadillac 0 points. Cadillac, they had the reliability issues, but once they will sort it out, I'm sure they can do pretty well. So this is how the Constructors Championship looks like. This is how the Drivers Championship looks like. And this is where we will be racing for the final time. So if you love Amsterdam and want to make a trip, better go, because it doesn't look like actually that the Zandvoort has, any sort of let's call it a desire to return to the Formula 1 calendar. But now let's talk about that sprint championship, right? So over here, before we talk about how well I've done over here, the sprint championship is, there are 6 sprints again. At the time of the recording, it hasn't been confirmed. There will be more 8 or 10 sprints, which would be quite interesting how F1 would handle it next season. But at the moment, it also means that you could have a sprint champion crowned, and that could be George Russell, who surprisingly is leading with 26 points. As I calculated it, I'm sure you guys will be loving it. He's won 2 races, 2 sprint races. Antonelli won 1. Norris, who's also on 26 points, won 1. That's very surprising, how different the tables look like. So basically, if Russell wins and Norris doesn't finishes outside of the top 8, so doesn't get any sprint points, then he would be the sprint champion over here. But Andrea Kimi Antonelli still has a chance. He's on 21 points, but obviously, Russell, he does need to win to get that buffer, from Norris, but let's say if Antonelli, then when he wins, obviously for Antonelli, he, at the moment, he's 5 points behind, so he needs to be 8 points behind. So if Antonelli then finishes 4th or lower, Russell will be champion. And same for Charles Leclerc, who's on 21 points, but this time, obviously, if basically Antonelli and Leclerc, if they don't finish on a sprint podium and Norris wouldn't get any points and Russell would win, he would be the sprint champion. That's how it stands. Lewis Hamilton on 18 points. He's pretty much out of the running now for the sprint championship, even though, that's where he gotten his first kind of a Ferrari victory, right? Then on 17 points, we have Oscar Piastri, and you can see that the top 3 teams really score lots of points, but Max Verstappen 7, only 9 points. He is the most successful driver in the history of the Sprint Championships, but quite struggles, so far in these. And then you have Liam Lawson 3 points, and then you had Pierre Gasly, Oliver Berman, and Arvid Lindbergh on 1 point for the Sprint Constructors Championship. Very, very close. Mercedes actually leading with 47 points, and McLaren there with 43 points with 15 points on offer. Obviously, we as Ferrari are on 39 points, so we would actually have a pretty good chance to still win if we do well in the sprints. But you can see that pretty much if Red Bull gets the 1-2 over there, then they would extend that lead, and obviously pretty much if a McLaren would then be unable to really challenge them. So the Constructors Championship could also be decided in a sprint. Red Bull on 9 points only, courtesy of Verstappen. Racing Bulls 5th on 4 points, and then you have Alpine and Haas 6, 7 respectively with 1 point. So you can see the Sprint Championship could be very exciting, because obviously the overall drivers in Constructors table won't change so much depending on how the sprint will finish, right? So that's why sometimes the drivers don't take it that seriously. But I hope that Formula One will really take note of this, because for example, when I was doing it, it was so exciting. I love these shorter races. It's great for lots of the fans, maybe ladies, also for kids, for example. You can really stay engaged, and you can really just push the car. You don't rely on the pit stops, right? The different tire strategies, whatnot, and usually the car doesn't break down. So it would be great to have a sprint championship. I hope you enjoyed this very exclusive section of the race introduction. And with regards to me, so I've won here in 2024. I won the Dutch Grand Prix. I always finish on a podium, but obviously I crashed out in 2023 qualifying. So I was starting 20th, but I got the 1 pole, always fastest lap. So I'm actually very confident heading into this race. I just hope that somebody won't hit me in a Tarzan turn, trying to be a Tarzan and hit me off like Verstappen did. I can't believe that actually that was a legal move. Otherwise, I would have already had these 65 race wins for Scuderia Ferrari. But I will be doing the Hungarian Grand Prix. I will be going for my 6th pole position. You will see it this weekend, and obviously we will also be aiming for incredible 5th fastest lap. We are really, really strong over here, and we will be hoping to get our 4th. We will be also aiming for our 5th podium, I believe, and then we will be going for our 4th race victory with a lead of 38 points. We can now see the light at the end of the tunnel, meaning that we really have a great now buffer. And in Hungary we've done really strongly, even though Verstappen actually had the better of us until he retired due to technical issues in that 2024 season. So hopefully he won't get one back on us, but thankfully he retired, because I could then equal and better Michael Schumacher's record of the most wins in the first 14 races. That was 13, and then 15 races. That was 14. So again, lots of racing returns with lots of history, lots of very, very important points on offer, and again, points to make mega history. So let's hope we can make a history here with Scuderia Ferrari, and we are happy that Formula One is back. It will be a really, really exciting, super busy, next 3.5 months. I hope you guys will enjoy it. I cannot wait for it, because we love racing, we love Formula One, we love Ferrari. Forza Ferrari!